to you today from Richmond Hill, and related to what Dr. Ascari said earlier, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land where I'm located today. The land is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm a guest in this space, and it's my shared obligation to respect, honor, and sustain the land. I'd also like to welcome everyone attending today to session 5 in the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Speaker Series for Disaster and Emergency Management. Our speakers today are Dr. Barbara Waruszynski, a defense scientist with the Director General, Personnel Research and Analysis in the Canadian Department of National Defense, and Dr. Jennifer Spinney, Assistant Professor in York University's Disaster and Emergency Management here in Toronto. Dr. Waruszynski's research areas include diversity and inclusion in the military, human rights, harassment and discrimination, gender integration, racism, ethnic intolerance, and inclusion in multinational military contexts, team diversity for enabling social cohesion and improved team performance in the military, and teamwork, collaboration in defense across federal scientific communities. Dr. Waruszynski is a published author and has given numerous presentations. She's the principal editor of a book on team diversity and inclusion in defense and security, international perspectives, scheduled to be published by Springer, next year in 2023. Her journal article on challenges of diversity and inclusion in defense emergency management and preparedness during the COVID-19 pandemic has received considerable attention, highlighting the need to examine diversity and inclusion and the implications on defense emergency management and preparedness. Dr. Waruszynski holds a doctoral degree from Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia. Dr. Spinney's research examines the various connections between groups of people living and working at the intersections of environment and society, particularly extreme weather hazards and disasters such as tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, and heat, especially in Canada and the US. Dr. Spinney focuses on interaction and language in use within and across groups to learn how virtual, face-to-face, and individual environmental encounters shape understanding, influence disaster response, and create differing experiences with recovery following disastrous events. Her past field investigations include the Joplin, Missouri E5 tornado, the flood event in the Canadian Arctic, and numerous projects working with government agencies to assist with enhancements to their forecast and warning systems, communication practices, and development. Dr. Spinney holds a doctoral degree from Western University in London, Ontario. Before we begin, I'd like to ask that any questions be held until the end of each speaker's presentation. As attendees will be on mute, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screens to send your questions and comments. Hopefully, there'll also be time at the end for any other questions you have for Dr. Waruszynski or Dr. Spinney. In order to keep the proceedings on track, our speakers have been allotted 30 minutes for each of their presentations. If everyone is comfortable, I'd like to start today's session with Dr. Waruszynski and her topic, Challenges of Diversity and Inclusion During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Implications on Canadian Defense, Emergency Management, and Preparedness. Dr. Waruszynski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I appreciate that. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I can do this properly. Okay, so this is not sharing as I would like it to share. Maybe okay, let me see here. There we go. Okay, let's just move it on up. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to talk with colleagues around the world with respect to looking at issues related to diversity and inclusion, and also with all of the COVID-19 pandemic that we've been experiencing, it's important to know in terms of how we deal with issues related to diversity and inclusion during a pandemic. So its focus with respect to emergency management and preparedness is absolutely critical. Now, before I go into this presentation, I also would like to acknowledge that Carleton Place, where I actually live, which is just outside of Ottawa, Ontario, is situated on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I think it's really important to actually acknowledge this, because a lot of the research that we do with respect to chief military personnel, we also deal with Indigenous people in the military. So making this acknowledgement is very important. So as Sharon stated, this is actually a presentation based on a journal article that was already written a while ago, probably 2021, I believe it was last year. It was actually very well received, and the whole purpose here was to ensure that the Canadian Armed Forces would be given enough information to work with respect to understanding the issues and the challenges impacting diverse groups or more marginalized groups, and how we can create a much more inclusive approach when we're dealing with issues related to emergency management and preparedness. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which will just give you an indication in terms of what I'll be talking about. So I'll give you a little bit of a background on this whole area, and also looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on diverse groups. And this part is very important because we've realized that there are specific groups that are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic far more than other groups. Racialized people, women, older adults, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ two-spirited plus communities. Those are the main marginalized communities that, or groups that we've actually looked at. But there's also the issue of intersectionality, which I'll get into a little bit more down the road. And then I also wanted to talk about a few recommendations that we put forward to the Canadian Armed Forces, and the concluding remarks. So when we look at this whole area of understanding risks and kind of the impacts that would impact diverse groups, very important in terms of understanding the psychosocial health challenges that they may be experiencing, that we may not even understand that very well as we should. So there was a requirement for the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces to actually get more involved, as you all know, through Operation Laser. And that was really to help in terms of understanding how to respond to a domestic pandemic issue. And this is related to this Operation Laser. So, but we need to look at more diverse and inclusive approaches to managing those risks and the impacts on diverse groups. So in order to understand our defense policy interventions, or how military operations could be impacted far more rigorously, we need to understand the different groups that we need to be looking at. So visible minorities, Indigenous people, women, older adults, persons with disabilities, again, LGBTQ two-spirited plus communities during the pandemic. So these are obviously the main groups that we looked at, and what we did is we actually did a literature review of some of the critical areas that we thought were important to examine, and we summarized it based on these particular groups. So if you look at in terms of racialized groups, and can you see the full screen? I hope you can see the full screen. Racialized groups, well, it's important to acknowledge that there are those who are among the visible minorities, especially looking at Blacks in the United States and United Kingdom, that are actually disproportionately impacted by COVID. And so we've looked at a number of areas with respect to that. And if I can just get my notes here, in terms of some of the critical components, in the United States, African Americans make up more than 30% of deaths and that was last year, they made up more than 30% of deaths attributed to COVID-19. And in the UK, Black people as well as Asian or Asian British people are about twice as likely to die from COVID as white people. Then health and socioeconomic disparities, higher chance of working in frontline jobs, having less access to healthcare, and being more likely to live in crowded or dense neighborhoods are all factors contributing to the higher death rates among Black people. And so this is, in terms of this component, was very important for us to acknowledge. And historically, Indigenous people, they've also been impacted by viral epidemics and pandemics throughout time. Specifically now we're looking at COVID-19 because they had a higher increased chance of risks associated with obesity, diabetes, respiratory and pulmonary diseases and infections. And also those who lived in more isolated communities, that actually helped to exacerbate some of the issues. So accessing healthcare services, having access to medications, medical equipment, and vaccinations can also become problematic. And then people of Asian descent, well, we've seen a number of media reports. They're talking about issues attributed to racism and how physical attacks, racial slurs, and even graffiti were all attributed to the number of Asians, especially in BC, with respect to being blamed for the coronavirus to begin with. So in terms of looking at women in particular, so we saw that a lot of the women were more likely to get COVID-19, even though we have a 54% of Canada's confirmed COVID-19 cases in 2021. I don't know what the percentage is today in 2022. However, at that point in time, a lot more women were actually exposed to COVID-19 as frontline workers, being nurses. For instance, they may be at higher risk. Women also face disproportionately higher demands at home. So again, trying to maintain a work-life balance and attending to children, looking at homeschooling, elder care, and other aspects attributed to that. A lot of women ended up staying at home with respect to taking care of their family. Women were also at a higher risk of experiencing family violence, and we've seen a number of reports coming in through that, whether it's physical, verbal, and sexual. Self-isolation measures, for instance, may contribute to increased domestic violence across Canada. We saw that in a number of reports. One report acknowledged 30% increase in some areas. And also there was another survey that focused on 1 in 5 Indigenous women as being victims of physical or psychological violence during the pandemic. So again, you're looking at disproportionate impacts on Indigenous and other racialized women, migrant women, women in low income environments, single mothers, again, LGBTQ two-spirited plus women, and women who possibly may have physical and mental disabilities or health issues. And these social and economic disparities, they actually impact from a intersectional approach. So this is why the whole aspect of intersectionality becomes very important to look at. Now, in terms of the elderly population, when we're talking about elderly Canadians, well, they may have pre-existing conditions. Again, diabetes, lung disease, respiratory illnesses, and heart disease. And that could actually create complications with respect to COVID-19. And we've also seen through the reports specifically related to the Canadian Armed Forces 2021 report that elderly Canadians did experience alleged abuses in Ontario long-term care homes. And it was really, really sad to see this. A lot of reports were coming out that the elderly were bullied, they were drugged, improperly fed, and in some cases left for hours and days in soiled beds. There are other issues with respect to other reports related to a lot of neglect. And that created a sense of great concern over a period of time. And I know that Ontario is looking at improving those facilities, but also in terms of understanding the behavioral implications of improving those kind of environments. Because ultimately we have to treat everyone with great respect and care. And then elderly people may be at a higher risk of experiencing different forms of financial abuse. And this was coming from the National Center on Elder Abuse. And they were focusing more on ways that people were using COVID-19 to basically extort money from elderly people, look at particular ways of getting into their homes, to whether they sanitize their homes, talk to them about making charitable contributions to help families afflicted by the virus. So again, the elderly people could be a vulnerable group that may do things out of the goodness of their hearts without realizing that there are compromised groups or compromised situations which are stemming from malinformed or environments or groups that are actually impacting these elderly people. Sorry about that. And then people with disabilities, again, a lot of issues attributed to health and safety concerns. So when you're working within your own home, you need to understand your space as a work environment. And you may not have all the specialized equipment that you would normally have in a workplace. So navigating through that new physical work environment could be very difficult. Even difficulties washing hands. So there are a number of aspects we need to look at in terms of understanding the health conditions, and also to understand what are some kind of the adverse impacts if persons with disabilities would contract COVID-19. And also having adequate information is important, and not everybody has that adequate information and availability of services. And people with disabilities, also, they may become socially isolated if they are not able to access community support on a regular basis. So living in that kind of a bubble, it may become very isolating and very difficult for somebody to be able to reach out to other members in the community. And legally blind people, again, who depend on touching physical objects to acquire information, may be at a greater risk for exposure or restricted access. So having that ability to touch when we're told that we need to constantly wash our hands or we cannot touch a number of objects because of COVID posed a lot of issues for people with disabilities. So then looking at the looking at the LGBTQ Two-Spirited Plus community. So again, when you're looking at national groups who have highlighted, actually a lot of research has highlighted that some LGBTQ Two-Spirited Plus people may be more vulnerable to impacts of COVID-19 due to having higher rates of cancer, HIV, smoking, and possibly healthcare discrimination. And we've also seen in some studies that they are at higher risk of domestic violence, mental health, and also face barriers accessing health services. Older members, again, so from an intersectional perspective, older members of the LGBTQ Two-Spirited Plus community are also more likely to be isolated or living alone. So understanding how these groups impact the different communities, it's a very, very important thing for the Canadian Armed Forces, because if they're part of Operation Laser and they're going out into the communities to help in terms of understanding what to do and how to understand the different communities and the challenges that they may face, then it becomes really important for them to understand all of these aspects and how they can apply these particular pieces of information or aspects to these groups and into their everyday working lives with the community. So this is really important and becomes part of the integration of the planning that is important. Now, from an intersectionality perspective or gender-based analysis perspective, it's important when you're looking at operational planning and emergency management and preparedness, because ultimately, if you don't understand the communities that you're serving and that you're dealing with, you don't understand the challenges that are impacting them, then you cannot help them in any effective way. So you need to ensure that, or at least we wanted to ensure that the Canadian Armed Forces would actually be consulting with subject matter experts across different areas related to diversity and inclusion in terms of looking at healthy and safety issues. So for us, for instance, it was defense advisory groups within the Department of National Defense, looking at also diversity and inclusion advisors, Public Health Agency of Canada, Health Canada, and Public Safety Canada. So through those subject matter experts, we're able to help to determine the challenges and the needs of diverse groups within the DND and the CAF specifically, and also in the Canadian communities that they serve more generally. And as part of operational planning, it's important to look at how we can actually have greater consultations with leaders and representatives of diverse communities. So it's not just within specific organizational groups, but it's also reaching out to other groups as well, including elders. So looking at needs, resources, challenges of individuals, groups, and communities. The more information that we know with respect to diverse and inclusive or diverse groups and how to create that inclusive environment is absolutely key in terms of bolstering our response to preparedness training for frontline workers. So for instance, elder care training with cultural awareness training becomes very fundamental to how we're actually able to develop greater sensitivities, our knowledge, our skills and capabilities to understand those unique challenges of diverse groups and what we can do to ensure that we are far more supportive and understanding of the issues that are impacting these diverse groups. And then in conclusion, for the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defense, diversity and inclusion is a top priority. I cannot emphasize that enough. We have conducted extensive research in this whole area on the Canadian Armed Forces. And also we have spoken about the need to look at this whole area in diversity in defense, emergency management, and preparedness, and to specifically look at those challenges and how those challenges are impacting specific diverse groups. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important that we actually look at different diverse communities, but we need to understand how effectively we need to respond to the unique challenges that specific groups may have. And we need to examine potential challenges and impacts of COVID-19 on diverse groups and communities within the context of emergency management and preparedness. So again, looking at what we've looked at, the racialized people, women, older adults, persons with disabilities, and members of LGBTQ two-spirited plus communities. If we understand the challenges through the research, through the literature that's out there, through media reports, we have a better appreciation of the issues that they are going through and also to help them to provide greater support in the end. So the recommendations that we offered were to enable the defense team to be more effective in terms of how they respond to the diverse needs of these people, and also to ensure that we are enabling the entire Canadian communities out there to work and understand the issues and the challenges far more integratively, but with respect to according greater respect to the different communities that we are a part of and that we support. So we need to bolster capabilities of the defense team personnel and emergency management to further support diverse communities. And it is through that constant liaising and understanding and networking that we actually appreciate what we need to do to be far more inclusive in our approaches with various diverse communities. And I believe that's it. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Waruszynski. We did have one question come in while you were making your presentation. The question was, is it possible to link to the recent article that just was mentioned about diversity and inclusion in emergency management during COVID-19? You could, I suppose, post it into chat, or I guess that's about the best place to put it. Or
Yeah, I can definitely do that. So I can just post it in chat. I think that's probably the easiest
Okay.
way. Thank you so much.
Hmm. There's a question for you from Senior Elder Hereditary Grand Chief Art Jefford. I don't know if are you seeing it in your question and answer?
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Is that the way it works? Okay.
You should be able to pull it up.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to take a look at chat. Is it the Q&A or the chat?
Q&A.
Okay.
Under open.
Okay. Okay, maybe it's a long one. Maybe if I can just type the answer, is that okay?
Absolutely. You can either, yep, no, where it says type answer, it's fine.
Okay,
It looks like it requires a little bit of thought.
I know, exactly. It's a very, very long comment, and I thank you for that.
Yeah. It's not one of these things I think that's going to be able to be answered in like 60 seconds.
No, but I definitely will respond. So thank you very much. I appreciate all the comments. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. I think that's the only question we got. Do we have any others? We had the request for the link, so that's fine. Oh, got another question. What are some of effective strategies of engaging with diverse communities?
Okay, so there are several ways you can do. I think, for instance, when we're looking at Indigenous communities, I think it's important to speak with elders as a start. I think we need to learn more in terms of understanding how we can create better engagement with Indigenous communities. And it is through that kind of reciprocation, I think we start to develop better communication and also conversation with greater respect for one another. And I think that's what needs to happen. We tend to kind of lump certain groups or marginalized groups into specific categories, but I think we need to appreciate that there are many different ways that you can reach out to different communities. So using your diversity and inclusion advisory groups, for instance, for us within the defense team is very important, because when we engage with our research, we need to ensure that we have a good appreciation of the issues that are impacting the different diverse advisory groups that we have. So for instance, we have diversity advisory groups for Indigenous people, and we have that also for visible minorities. We also have it now for LGBTQ spirited plus. So when you look at all of those aspects, you start to develop an understanding in terms of some of the issues that are impacting specific communities, and then how you can go about having dialogue, further dialogue through workshops, through seminars, through webinars, however you do it, but we try to reach out as much as we can. So there are many different ways, but I think communication is probably the most important and most effective way to explain your research, to, as a researcher, to be able to dialogue with various communities, to bring your research out there so you can then get feedback coming back from other people. So open dialogue, communication, establishing workshops, webinars, seminars, however you want to do it. I think it provides open communication for everybody to look at specific ways of improving the relationships that they have within the communities.
Okay, we had another question that was related to that extremely similarly, was what are some of the effective strategies of engaging with diverse communities? I think you've already addressed it. So in fairness to Dr. Spinney, I think we'd like to move on. So if you're ready to go, Dr. Spinney, you can unmute yourself.
Sure.
There you
Thanks
go.
very much, Sharon. Can you all hear me? Yeah, I hope so. Let me close out some things and open other things here. Okay. So hopefully you see my presentation here. You see my title slide, Sharon? Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me today. Thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to present in this final series of the equity, diversity and inclusion in DEM. That's, put forward by CIFAL. I am also joining from York University, which is situated on the traditional territory of Takaranto, and that has been taken good care of by the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. Today I'm here to talk with you about what I'm calling the social life of structures. I had intended on sharing some study results from an investigation that we carried out this past summer following the derecho, the May 21st derecho, but I'm not quite far enough along in my analysis yet, so I'll be presenting on a different extreme wind case. But I wanted to give you a sense for what the title means to me. The social life of structures, I kept seeing that there was an overemphasis on structural aspects of disaster recovery from extreme wind events. And arguably, rebuilding one's home is the most critical feature that happens during recovery. We could even consider it being central to disaster recovery. But recovery from tornado disasters also so much more. And alongside the rebuilding of people's homes, the four walls and putting the roof back on, people are having to rebuild their lives, both socially and emotionally. There's really so much happening within these structures. People's identity is intimately connected to these structures, their place of residence. And so I suppose I wanted to emphasize that part, that life part that has been affected so much, and that life part that is in need of rebuilding after an extreme wind event. So with that, I will move forward here. I want to head right into my purpose for today. My purpose is to first share some details that impart the importance of official designations on for ways of responding and rules, and how these official designations and rules have implications for equitable access to resources and recovery following tornado disaster. Oops. I wanted to also share different experiences with tornado disaster to highlight the diverse trajectories that unfold for recovery, the diverse possibilities that unfold. And then finally, to impart upon the audience the value of an ethnographic approach for revealing ongoing needs during later stages of recovery. I think it's also important to provide some details about my approach to research. I'm trained as a sociocultural anthropologist. And so at the very core of my training is understanding people. And what I do is I adopt a political ecology viewpoint. And this means I'm looking at people, I'm paying attention to their everyday lived experiences, their everyday practices, and I'm looking at how people are interacting with both their physical environment and their social environment. So how are people relating to their physical environment? Let's say when tornado winds are presenting themselves, how are social structures shaping different disaster outcomes? How are social structures enabling or constraining different possibilities for recovery? And I do this by using a qualitative ethnographic approach. This means that to the greatest extent possible, I'm examining people in their cultural setting with the goal of producing what we call a narrative account. So by going and talking with people, my aim is to achieve this rich and thick description of what's happening in people's lives. I aim to generate representative findings, not generalizable findings. And I'm also approaching this inductively. So I'm not entering the field with some preconceived notion or a already conceived of hypothesis. what I do is I go into the field, I make observations, or I talk with people and I make observations. I see what patterns are emerging, and then we generate our results from those patterns. And then finally, I do this by embracing the notion of cultural relativism, which really is the idea that when I'm talking with people, I'm understanding the perspectives they're sharing with me from their point of view. Now, for this study, I'm focusing on recovery. And for this presentation, I'm focusing on recovery. My training and what I've spent a lot of time focusing on is risk perception, sense making, looking at relational or interactional features that shape perceptions of risk and how we make sense of the world. But again, for this presentation, I'm focusing on recovery, and there's plenty of definitions in the literature for what recovery means. The restoration and improvement of facilities, livelihoods, and so on. Again, my focus is more closely centered on social recovery, so the recovery of households, neighborhoods, and communities. And then also important to this particular presentation is psychosocial recovery. This process focused on the establishment or restoration of long-term mental health and psychosocial well-being of affected populations. And then continuing with this theoretical framing, I'll just add quickly that I move forward in this presentation with these understandings that recovery is complex, multidimensional, and nonlinear, that it unfolds over a long time and can last for decades. And when we talk about recovery unfolding over a long time and lasting for a long time, I'm wanting us to draw our attention more closely towards this concept of shielding, which is something that Mika and Kelman put forward in one of their articles. I have the reference listed at the end. Now, shielding is this way of describing later recovery or slow recovery. It stands for slow healing, or when you combine that, shielding. And this is just a new language for talking about, again, a later stage of recovery. It intends to denote recovery as this ongoing individual and collective labor that we engage in to remake and rebuild our lives after disaster. And what it also tries to do is pull us away from disaster recovery as a single point in time, and instead think of disaster recovery as this process, this ongoing process that happens in the present. It's not just something that people experienced at the time, let's say a tornado touches down. And so with this framing in mind, let's move on to the case here. What I will be talking about for the duration of my time with you is the September 21st, 2018 tornado outbreak that occurred through Ontario. I will be looking more closely at the Kinburn-Dunrobin-Gatineau tornado. So this was one of several tornadoes that occurred that afternoon. So this Kinburn-Dunrobin-Gatineau tornado, it developed as part of a much larger outbreak that I mentioned. I call it the Dunrobin tornado, mostly because the damage primarily occurred in Dunrobin. And also because most of the people I spoke to, in carrying out my study, most of my participants resided in Dunrobin or were affected residents residing in Dunrobin. In actuality, the Dunrobin tornado affected several communities along its damage path. It first developed west of Kinburn, Ontario, causing structural and tree damage there as it tracked northeast through Dunrobin before crossing the Ottawa River into Quebec, and finally dissipated over in Gatineau. The Dunrobin tornado was the strongest tornado to hit the region that day. There were 7 tornadoes in the entire outbreak. And it's also, of course, I'm not sure now because, I was going to say, I'm not sure how it compares with Barry, but I still think that rated as at an EF3, where winds reach 265 kilometers per hour, this is still considered the strongest tornado to hit Eastern Ontario since 1902. Now, in this event, greater than 50 homes were damaged or destroyed, and there were several injuries that were reported. So here on the left, you see the map. I've circled this Kinburn-Dunrobin-Gatineau damage path. This is provided by Northern Tornadoes Project. And then This is the community of Dunrobin that afternoon. So this struck the community on a Friday afternoon around 5 p.m. And so I think it's also really important for me to say at this point that the Northern Tornadoes Project funded the study that I'm talking with you about today. The Northern Tornadoes Project is situated at Western University. So what I did was I attempted to learn the perspectives of residents who were affected by this tornado. And so what I did was I followed a semi-structured interview guide where each resident who signed up, where we engaged in conversations over the phone or over Zoom. It's not traditional ethnographic work, but it was the best that we could do given that we were in the middle of the pandemic. I carried out 17 interviews with 23 residents. Participants experienced a range of tornado strength winds. You can see here that 4 experienced EF0 strength winds, whereas 3 experienced EF3 strength winds. And so this was by me corresponding their residence, their location, with a map that Northern Tornadoes Project provided me with. And you can also see that the sample comprises of residents of different ages and stages in their life, comprising both females and males, and then different household compositions. Now, moving on, I'll share a tornado timeline, a tornado disaster timeline. And basically, I'm doing this to offer you a window into how the days immediately following the tornado unfolded generally. So on Friday, of course, the tornado happens. Firefighters were soon into the community doing safety checks. The community was quickly closed. A secure perimeter was established, and residents were ushered to the community center where they were instructed to register for disaster relief. Come Saturday, residents returned to the community center for the first of many information sessions. By Sunday, residents returned again to the community center to learn the results of the city inspection. That means engineers were in the community over the weekend looking at the structural damage and determining how extensive the damage was for particular homes. By Sunday, when people received their slip, depending on the color of slip they received, they were granted re-entry into the community and to their home, typically for around 30 minutes. And these visits were also supervised generally by firefighters. And then of course, by Monday, this is when recovery begins, when they begin salvaging whatever they can, cleaning up, protecting their house for future risks, which we'll talk about, and then beginning to engage in that insurance and rebuilding process. And so while there is general consistency with this tornado timeline, there is significant variability for how each of these steps or stages played out for the affected residents. In each of these stages, we could consider that there are multiple points of trauma that really are happening, these unique points of trauma for residents, trauma that affected them in different ways based on a whole range of factors. But the factors I will focus on today illustrate the variability of experience. I'll comment on hazard exposure. I'll talk about cascading hazards and risk, talk a little bit about disruption and disorientation, centering that part mostly on displacement. And all with the idea that these factors and more factors, there's more, I'm just focusing on these factors are weaving together in any number of ways to create a variety of impacts, both emotionally and structurally. So let's get into the hazard exposure. Of the 23 residents who I interviewed, 12 were home during the tornado and 11 were away during the tornado. So generally, people were any one of 3 things. They were either away on vacation or out of town. Like these folks here, NTP9, they learned about the tornado through their friends, actually. They first saw the damage to their home on TV and news. So you can imagine how shocking that would be, that you are away, you have no idea that a tornado is happening, but in the first indication you have is to watch the news and see your home on the television. So on the one hand, these residents were spared having to face the threat. but they experienced a deeper level of uncertainty regarding the impact of the tornado on their home. There were also people at home taking cover. Okay, so people away on vacation out of town, but also people at home taking cover, just like NTP 14 here. She heard a roar of wind. The husband yells, "Get down, get our son, get down here quick." They see the front door blowing open and they just have enough time to run down the hallway and huddle around the fridge. So people taking cover. There's also other people taking cover, like NTP 15, where he's going to his the roof of his carport to, I think, remove the clothes from the clothesline. When the wind picked up so severe that he could not move, he had to hold on to the hot tub. He was just so thankful that he had filled the hot tub the week before, because then it was heavy enough where it also didn't blow away in the wind. And then there were also people who were away from home, but in town. Okay, so the tornado occurred, like I said, at the end of a work week, at the end of the work day. And so people were on their way home from work, just like NTP 4, who's referred to here in this quote. He was driving home from work that day when his daughter called from the house. She was there with her little brother. They were 12 and 10, respectively. She told her dad about the tornado alert, and he instructed her to go to the basement with her brother. He told her to stay on the phone. And thankfully, the lines of communication weren't broken. And so they stayed on the phone the whole time. She and her brother were underneath the stairs, and he on the other end of the line is hearing lots of noises and commotion while he's hoping that the children are staying safe. So you can imagine the trauma that a parent is experiencing when they're on the phone with their kids who are at home, and you have no idea what might happen or if they're going to come out of this alive. Also, other people were at the Carp Fair. This is an annual event, extremely popular in the region. It's an agricultural festival. There's amusement parks. It's a family affair. Kids are removed from school to attend. So this resident, I didn't mark it here, NTP 20, and her 2 kids and her mother were at the fair. They shut down the fair and sheltered people in a barn. And NTP 20 says, "I didn't feel safe there." And so what they decided to do was leave the barn, get back in their car, and drive the close distance to her home. She actually saw the tornado in the sky before taking shelter at a stranger's house. Okay, in addition to the variability of hazard exposure, participants had varying degrees of experience with cascading hazards and risks. These are these secondary hazards that were brought on because of the tornado and the damage that the tornado brought. So extreme rain in the days following the tornado brought on flood risks to homes whose roof or where the roofs were exposed due to the tornado. Cold temperatures and the power being off in home for months created additional risks of pipes freezing and foundations cracking. And then during the rebuild process, many participants talked about the extra challenges that COVID-19 presented, ordering supplies or having contractors come to their house, for example. Now, moving on to disruption and disorientation. Likewise, this took many, many shapes for the participants of my study. They commented on devastation and that when they emerged from their homes or their basements, it was like a crime scene. Disruption, I captured this from perspectives that talked about not being able to get back home, unable to communicate with children, not knowing where they're going to go after the tornado, not having their essentials and being worried about prescription medication or documents, ID, for example, worrying about looters, worrying about homelessness, not having any sense of routine, not having any sense of familiarity anymore, worrying about the kids because the kids aren't settled, and also disruptions to employment. So we see NTP 14 here is talking about emerging from their home. This is the person who hid or huddled with her family by the fridge. looking up and all of a sudden seeing the sky because the second floor of their house was now gone. And then NTP 16 talking about feeling lost in her own community. So again, these are notions of disruption and disorientation. Now, displacement is a specific form of disruption. It brings on disorientation. For those residents who were displaced, of my sample, 16 of the 23 could no longer go back to their home. And they moved back home anywhere between 4 months and 17 months post-event. Of my sample, the person who returned to their home last, it was dated in March 2020, right before COVID hit. So when it comes to displacement, people who were displaced sometimes experience multiple displacements before moving back to their house, moving to several temporary residences. Some people were able to secure housing in the community, and sort of be close to where the rebuild was happening, whereas others were temporarily displaced outside of the community. And this made it difficult for people to feel connected to what was happening in the community.
Feel, oh, sorry, I see something happening. Do you see it also, or is it different?
Yes, there was an alert from Ontario, so you can continue. Probably that is why you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So where people are being displaced is important because we're learning from the research that if you are outside of the community and displaced, then it produces different impacts, different emotional impacts, feelings of disconnection. And then during displacement, while residents are establishing new routines and trying to regain a sense of familiarity, most were engaged in the rebuilding process. And so this means that in most, if not all cases, their days are filled with interactions with insurance representatives, builders, contractors, service providers, city officials. It was just extremely overwhelming. It was reported as being similar to a full-time job where you had to really fight every day to receive these yes responses, that you'd have to go into this just with the assumption that you're going to hear no, and then you have to determine how to argue for that yes answer. Now, I'm not going to talk about the structural impacts per se, but what I'd like to do is talk about how rules surrounding response and recovery have implications for structural recovery, okay? So displacement, it speaks to the structural damage that people experienced as a result of the tornado, and sometimes also because of these cascading hazards that I had mentioned before. Now, in one participant's case, they were located outside of the original official damage path. So what happens after a tornado is that government representatives go in and they assess the damage, and based on the assessed damage, they generate the strength of the winds. So certain damage is associated with certain strengths of winds. And then based on the damage that they're seeing, they can carve out the path of the storm. So the yellow part on this map indicates the original path, the original zone for where the tornado occurred. And this was almost immediately after the tornado, right? September 21st, 2018. The portion in red was added after extra assessment, and that happened the beginning of October. And this purple part here, that was added after additional assessment, and that took place in the middle of November. So the participant that's referenced on the slide here, NTP 15, well, they live in the purple zone. So because they weren't included in the official original damage path, they couldn't register with Red Cross at the community center. Registering with Red Cross would give them access to different forms of aid and relief. But because this participant wasn't located within that damage path, or at least originally, he wasn't able to secure anything, whether it was just for food, just very simple items. They mentioned that they have to fight to have their area added. It took the efforts of the MPP to sort of facilitate this. And it was eventually done, like I said, but not until almost 2 months after the event, which you can imagine how challenging that might be for someone. Now, secondly, another example, these changes to building codes. And changes to building codes, I'm wanting to talk here about the implications that that has for recovery possibilities. And it certainly has implications for the recovery possibilities that NTP 18 is afforded. So when I'm talking with everyone, they're telling me about insurance and how insurance gives certain pockets of funding. That is, if you have insurance, right? Most people do, but not everyone does. But this pocket of funding has to cover everything in your rebuild. And now, if building codes have changed since your home was constructed, then reconstruction after a tornado must be done in such a way that ensures compliance with the building codes. And these kinds of changes can manifest in any number of ways. But for the participant in this study, it was determined during their engineering study that their home needed to be raised because it was too close to the water table. So in order to ensure that this family had compliance with the code, the homeowner needed to incorporate raising the house into that pocket of funding. And then if you have accessibility needs, which this family does, then the challenge is only compounded. Not only do you have to use the allotted funds to ensure compliance with the code, but you also have to use them to ensure that you can have your functional needs met in your everyday life. Again, there aren't typically provisions in insurance to account for these extra costs that are required either due to the rules in place or due to accessibility needs, which in my mind creates inequitable outcomes, inequitable possibilities for disaster recovery. Now I'll move on to emotional impacts. People in this case experienced a range of emotional impacts, suffering from anxiety in the early months, either as new or worsening conditions. Others reported a numbness coming over them, this profound loss coupled with a sense of there's just so much to do to sort of gain our footing here. Shock was also reported by participants, feeling lost, not really knowing what's happening. Others reported having difficulty sleeping and being overwhelmed. And then there were also 2 residents in my sample who experienced panic attacks in the early days, as NTP 20 is reported as experiencing here on this slide. Now, these are all emotional impacts that people reported as experiencing in the early days after the tornado, but I interviewed people almost 2 years after the event, and some of the perspectives that were shared with me are evidence of ongoing impacts. Okay, 2 years after the event, this showed up in terms of people's being nervous to travel around the same time as the tornado took place, but mostly in terms of the weather, when warnings were issued, when it was stormy outside, or when the winds were picking up. And I've included a range of examples here. Tornado warnings creating terror, NTP talking about how they're afraid, NTP 10 rather talking about how they're afraid, NTP 21 talking about how they worry all the time, that anytime that there's a storm, and then NTP 22 talking about it freaking them out, and that by this summer, again, this summer being the summer of 2020, they thought that they would be over this, that they thought that it would be better by now. So even 2 years later, there's ongoing impacts. And this is just coming through from that rich description that people are sharing with me. But I'm also asking people, or I did ask people who participated to tell me about recovery. I asked them, would you say that you've recovered from the tornado? And here are just a couple examples of people who indicate they're recovering, as in they still are engaged in the recovery process, and that it hasn't yet quite been achieved. Now, this is even though people are back in their homes, right? NTP 15 moved back in their home already, but 2 years later is still just managing. And NTP 1, likewise, has moved back in their home. They have a safe place to live, but they still have this ongoing anxiety and fear. And so this is what brings me to my final slide here. Now, over the last 20 minutes or so, and I hope that it's just been around that time, I provided you with a snapshot of disaster experience and some of the factors that contribute to these experiences and then impacts, and the different ways people are sort of making their way through the recovery process. And I focused on bringing light to this relationship between people, their physical environment, and the social structures, those rules and processes within which people are embedded and sort of having to navigate and maneuver around. And I've done so for the purpose of highlighting, let's circle back to my purpose here, that official designations, rules have implications for equitable access to resources and recovery, that different experiences with tornado disaster create diverse trajectories for recovery, and that there's great value in taking an ethnographic approach for revealing these ongoing needs during later stages of recovery. Now, I've approached this talk in this way to focus on recovery, but to demonstrate the presence of these ongoing impacts and that they're reflective of that concept of shielding that I introduced earlier on, Mika and Kelman's concept of shielding, that slow healing after disaster during that later stage recovery, where we also are thinking of recovery not as an event in a single point in time and space, but as this continuous, ongoing, gradual, and open-ended process occurring in the present. And finally, this knowledge, I mean, research for research's sake is just fine and well, but research to make a difference is really what's important. And I think we can use this new knowledge in disaster management. Particularly, we can use what we learned from this case and other cases to support, in the very least, conversations regarding enhanced disaster response procedures, maybe those that don't rely on official damage path for distributing aid to people who need it, or possibly serving as the foundation for conversations with insurance folks about how we can create a system that ensures both compliance with building codes, but doesn't limit possibilities for equitable recovery. And then lastly, we could maybe even use this new knowledge as evidence of slow healing to enhance psychosocial support and resources that we make available to disaster survivors in later stages of recovery. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now, or you can email me, or you can, reach out on Twitter. Also, thank you to the participants of this study. Thank you for Western for funding this, and thank you to the participants of this forum for listening this afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Spinney. We actually do have a couple of questions for you. First one says, Dr. Spinney's presentation has a subject matter expert carefully deconstruct the impact and aftermath of disaster on people and their environment. Very, very useful. May we get a copy of the presentation?
Oh yeah, of course. No problem.
I think that goes without saying. We will, having recorded this, we'll definitely make it available to all the participants. Next question is from a person from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I don't want to name names. It said, thank you for sharing. I'm from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and this seemed a little too familiar. We had a derecho in 2020 that wiped out 60 to 75% of our tree line and left us with no cell phone coverage for 3 days, no power for an average of 3 weeks, and without internet for longer. So it's just a comment more than anything else.
No, I think that for this participant on the forum here, I think that was the derecho that it spanned a range of states. Like it actually, I think it was 4 or 5 states. But when communication shuts down, it makes it obviously extremely challenging for responding, for understanding if your families are safe, for officials to ensure successful response. I mean, there are so many implications. And it's so important to have redundancy in our communication systems and networks.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, Ali's raised his hand.
All right.
Okay, ask away, Ali.
Thank you very much. Thank you for both presentations. It was great. Thank you so much for that. I have a couple of questions. I start with Dr. Spinney's presentation. And by the way, being in the panelist part, I could not type in my question in the Q&A. Otherwise, I would have done that as well. But just to encourage discussions, I am going to ask this question. First of all, I really want to congratulate you for this research. Doing research in disaster recovery myself, I know how less attention has been paid into this part of disaster and emergency management research, especially in Canada. So I'm happy to hear that you are and see that you are doing great fundamental research in this area, and this is going to be really helpful building our disaster recovery literature as well as practice. Thank you for that. And my question, I know this particular emergency or tornado really impacted the remote rural type of community. How would you consider this as whether this was in a sense helped impacted community to better cope because it was limited in terms of number of people being impacted, or on the other hand, being remote, being rural, they may have not been received as much as attention as it could have, or it had happened in another larger central type of settlement, basically.
Yeah,
that's my first question. I stop here. Thank you.
okay, thanks for that, Dr. Asghari. Dunrobin is not incredibly rural. I mean, they might call it rural, but it's very close to Ottawa. So they had the support of Ottawa almost immediately. I mean, Carleton Place is around Dunrobin, and Carleton Place is also very close to Ottawa. So I can't tell you specifically, but one might even consider this to have that feeling of both being rural, being out in the outskirts, but having very good access to city services. I think one of the challenges for this community in this event was that there were also 911 reports coming in from other communities further away. So for example, Kinburn, right? Because if you remember, the tornado that affected Dunrobin began in Kinburn, began west and traveled northeast, eventually dissipating in Gatineau. And so people in Dunrobin are experiencing the tornado and can't get through to 911, and they hear the fire trucks, but the fire trucks are going past them because the fire trucks are going to the calls in the order that they were received. And so they're heading over to Kinburn first. So I don't know if the rural factor played as much of a role as this was widespread enough that it was creating impacts and requiring services that had to be shared amongst a broader scope, a broader geography.
Thank you. I see Barbara's hands up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry for interjecting. Jennifer, I just want to let you know it was a great presentation. I live in Carleton Place.
Oh, okay.
I went through the derecho
Okay.
as an example. And we also went through when Dunrobin was hit hard. A lot of us were hit in different pockets. Coming and living in this town of Carleton Place now for about 22 years. It's amazing how many services we have. We are very grateful, even though the entire town of Carleton Place was completely almost decimated. I couldn't believe that what the derecho actually did this past May. Our house was badly impacted. Many trees were down. We called 911. They responded right away. It's amazing how the community of Carleton Place came together, including hydro and hydro workers coming in from New Brunswick and the States were helping out. It was amazing in terms of the community resilience that enabled everyone to work together, even though, you know, you still have this awful feeling, what if in the future you go through another derecho? We realized that the community response that we had was really fundamental to our healing and our moving forward. So I thought I'd just tell you that.
No, I like that. And Barbara, can you then confirm you're close to Ottawa, right?
Yes, so I'm in Carleton Place, which is about 25 minutes away from Ottawa. And it's not far at all. I've been commuting for 22 years back and forth to work. But to say that, we're about 11,000 people in the town of Carleton Place. But in terms of the services that we have, and also the way that we work with other communities, including Ottawa, it's absolutely phenomenal. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful to all of those organizations, especially the people who really reached out.
Thanks for that. And if I could just add quickly that Dunrobin, or the area more generally, is quite unique in so much as they've developed a community disaster relief association, the West Carleton Disaster Relief Association. And I think that has played a tremendous role in assisting people during those early days after the tornado, and then in the weeks and months afterward following, you know, facilitating community dinners and Christmas gift drives. There was so much support. I think there was even a volunteer from the community who may have been working with West Carleton Disaster Relief to establish a lost and found. So this person would go out and search for everything, and then have it all on a table for people to come and retrieve their items that had blown away in the wind, essentially. Again, I'm not sure if they were affiliated, but the West Carleton Disaster Relief Association was instrumental, I think.
I'm not seeing any more questions.
In that case, can I ask my second question, if possible?
Sure.
Thank you. And that question is about, I noticed you mentioned a couple of observations with regard to sort of education, training, warning. How important, in your view, was that element? And is that something that we can, or we should promote it more, or spend more investment or money on this aspect, training and education, specific to tornadoes, I mean?
Okay. Apologies, I didn't know if that question was for me or for Barbara. It's for me, right, Ali? Yeah.
Yeah, it is for tornado.
You know,
sure.
I enter into these studies with probably very ambitious goals, you know, for how we can change things for the better. But I also have to recognize that my one little study, again, it's not generalizable. It points to a finding that is valuable. And I do think that it gives us an opportunity to at least start asking the questions and start having the conversations. How that plays out, what kind of big outcomes we could hope for or have materialize from those conversations, I can only begin to imagine. But I certainly think that we're at the stage now where we should be able to come together, different groups around the same table, and start talking about the challenges that we each experience, and to try and find these points of connection for how to make things being the process better for everyone. So sure, I have lots of ideas that are much bigger than just conversations, but I think I need to be realistic with what I'm able to achieve personally. But that's certainly a next step, would be to have roundtable discussions, bring everyone together. And that's what I'm hoping to do I'm carrying out a study on the Barrie tornado recovery process as well. And that one specifically includes interviews with insurance representatives, construction representatives, city officials, and then with the goal of trying to understand how each group is experiencing the recovery and how we can make it better based on those perspectives.
Thank you very much. I have one question for Dr. Waruszynski, if that's possible, but I prefer also to hear from our moderator and also the participants if they have questions. They are the first. If not, let me ask my question. And again, thank you very much. A very, very interesting report, and I think this is highly, of course, needed. My question is more about the outcome or output of the research in terms of how much of the recommendations, which were really great, and I think those who were involved in COVID-related research appreciate those findings. How much of those have been or are being incorporated into protocols, policies? Maybe they have been already, but in your perspective, how much of that can be actually incorporated in our future protocols and policies? Thank you very much. This is, of course, a question for you, Barbara. Thanks.
Thank you, Ali. In fact, a lot of our diversity inclusion research is being incorporated into the diversity strategy, or I should say the extension of the diversity strategy. So in terms of the diversity inclusion reports that we're coming out with, they've actually incorporated our article as well as our recommendations in terms of our research. So that tells you that there is a great interest in terms of where we need to go, because ultimately, if you listen to Dr. Teresa Tan, the future is uncertain, and we may have other pandemics, and we need to understand from all communities, not just the military, but all communities, how we can learn from the different diverse groups, how we need to take that learning, whether it's cultural awareness training, whether it's understanding how to deal with the elderly, whether it's understanding what racialized communities go through, LGBTQ2 spirited plus, however you define it, it's important for us to understand through the research, especially through the research, as Jennifer's research, what we need to do to establish better practices, best practices, and also lessons learned. So how we need to establish better communications. The more we know, the better we develop in terms of our subject matter expertise, our knowledge banks, our training, our skills, and we're able to cope better in terms of knowing how to deal with specific circumstances with particular diverse groups. So that's important. I was actually writing a few notes down here. So we also have to learn how to understand our unconscious biases. So, and this is part of the research that I've been doing, and this is going to be now hopefully implemented down the road through the defense community, to understand what kind of training do we need in order for us to improve who we are as people, to remove ourselves away from the stereotypes, to stop discriminating against others, or understand what it means for specific groups to go through harassment and what that actually feels like on a day-to-day basis. So this whole area of coaching and mentoring, looking at effective communication strategies, is trying to even establish a diversity and inclusion toolkit for organizations is important, because it's going to help people to develop their skills better. Right now, I'm actually working on a very important project, which is called the Allies Project. So what it basically is for all of the Canadian Armed Forces to look at the concept of allies and see how they actually could enable greater diversity and inclusion in the Canadian military. So you see how all of the research that we're doing is actually being pushed into the day-to-day practices of the military, and it's helping them to train what they need to do, how they need to apply themselves, and especially when they're dealing with different communities in the Canadian population. I actually I was training a very specialized group in the Canadian military on racism. So it's important that when they start to develop those and apply those skills, then they actually understand through the research on the Canadian military what they need to do to improve their ways, their communication, how their interactions, and also to move forward together. Because ultimately, if you're talking about inclusion, you're talking about creating a culture of belonging, a climate of belonging, an environment where people feel that their contributions have merit. If in the greater community, we do not create this sense of belonging, then you know what, we're all fragmented and we're going to remain fragmented. So we need an opportunity for all of us to learn and apply, because organizations need to learn and apply what, especially the diversity and inclusion research that we're doing, what they need to do to improve the way ahead for everyone, because it's not just at a professional level that we need to improve, it's really truly at the personal level. Because once the personal level is established or improved, then you know how most of the time at the professional level, you will think differently. You will apply yourself in a much better frame of mind. And so creating that inclusive environment is key. So just to sum up, the research that we're doing all the time on the Canadian military is being applied into policy. It's being applied into training mechanisms. It's being applied at all different levels of the Canadian military. And that is key. And if we are trying to instill better skills and knowledge for the military, for the Canadian military, that goes a long way, because it's not just domestic operations, it's also international operations. And so when you think about all the different types of people that you would be looking at or talking to, especially at the international level, when people go on deployments, it's amazing how many different cultures that we tap into. So cultural awareness training, unbiased or unconscious bias training, understanding bystander intervention training, all of these aspects are really important, and they are embedded for the way ahead for the military.
We have a really great follow-up question from one of our participants. They said they apologize if it was answered already, but I don't think it has. It says, in your experience, Dr. Waruszynski, what has been the greatest challenges in establishing communications and connections with diverse and marginalized groups?
I think one of the biggest challenges is being taken seriously. So if, for instance, I gave a keynote speech for the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and here I am, a white female, giving a presentation on it, but the presentation that I gave was on the voices and the lived experiences of racialized people in the Canadian military, and also civilians in the Department of National Defense. So in essence, I was kind of like a channeler in terms of the issues and the challenges, and also the recommendations for the way ahead. I think the biggest challenge is for people to establish a sense of trust, to listen to each other, to be sincere about wanting to learn from one another, to apply a greater understanding, and also a want to learn about different cultures, for instance. I think it goes a long way when we are respectful of one another and try to reach out to learn from each other, and not to constantly denigrate each other in the worst possible way, but to remove ourselves from the stereotypes, from the systemic racism that always has basically dictated where we are today. We need to move away from those elements and try to establish a greater sense of humanity, because that's in essence what we are all about. We are all human beings, and how you want to define it, if you want to create those marginalized environments, and people do that all the time. I'd like us to actually move away from creating those marginalized environments or groups and start focusing on how we can establish a greater sense of humanity together. Because in essence, this is where we need to go forward, is together.
Absolutely. Oh, you're welcome. Just, I don't know if we've got any more questions. Doesn't look like it. I think that's about it for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Waruszynski and Dr. Spinney for their informative presentations. Both have noted, depending on their organization and purpose, human structures, whether it's a family or it's a military, have unique ways of responding to disasters and emergencies. Creating space for the inclusion of diverse narratives can only enhance and strengthen the 5 pillars that we grew up with in DEM: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. With the introduction of kind of the term shaling, correct me if I'm wrong, that kind of opens up an entirely new vista as far as interpreting what people need and when they need it, as well as how long they need it for. So anyway, thank you very much, both of you. And I'll turn this to Ali.
Yes, thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you to presenters and our great participants. Thank you for being with us up until now. I particularly want to thank you, Sharon, for your time, for moderating this session. I know, and I want to mention that you are one of our great alumni, always supporting the program, and also disaster and emergency management field in general. Thank you for doing that, and we are also looking forward to see your ongoing book on history of disaster and emergency management that you are currently working on. And I appreciate your time and energy for on this. And with that, we are going to conclude this session. But before that, I just want to quickly mention about our next session that is going to be 2 weeks, in 2 weeks. And this is our last session of this series. Although, as I mentioned, we may extend this for another 2 sessions. And looking forward to see you all again in 2 weeks' time. All the best for the rest of the day and the week. Thank you.
Great.
All of you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, Ali. Nice to meet you, Barbara. And thank you, Sharon, if you're still here. Oh, no. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Sharon. I see you now. Okay. And bye, Francesco.
Thank you, everyone.
It's
Really
nice meeting you
appreciate
both.
it. Nice meeting all of you.
Okay.
Take
All
great
right.
care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.